It gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker for today. She's not here in presence. She's in Camden or near Camden, New Jersey, where the USS New Jersey battleship is moored, permanently moored. Anyway, it's a pretty impressive structure if you've ever been there, or vessel, I should say. And one thing that always caught my attention was just the firepower of the thing. You know, the USS New Jersey has a 16-inch shell that would let go. A 16-inch shell is about the size of a Volkswagen bus, and they can project at more than 25 miles, I think, if I remember correctly. But anyway, Libby is who's speaking to us, Libby Jones, and she is the director of curatorial and education for the Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. So without further ado, I'll turn the ball over to Libby. Libby?
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for having me. So first and foremost, as someone mentioned, we are in Camden. If you have heard that the ship was in dry dock, we are back. We're open. So if you haven't come to visit us, definitely do. So the ship itself is we're called Battleship New Jersey for a reason. We are a battleship. We are not just a generic warship. What makes us special compared to other types of warships, we've got the big guns and the big armor on us. So if you've seen Intrepid, we love her. Not a battleship. That's an aircraft carrier. So she is built at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. That's why they put her here as a museum. She's a local girl, as we like to say. So we're actually just about to celebrate the anniversary of her keel being laid. That's the backbone of the ship. Like I said, she's built at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. So it's right next to where the Eagles, the Flyers, the Phillies play, right there in the Navy Yard. While the Navy Yard no longer builds ships, it is still an active yard. They are still working on ships there. That's where we went to dry dock a few months ago. So it was very nice for us to get to go home. She is launched on December 7th, 1942. So that's the first time she was put in the water, and they smashed that bottle of, okay, it wasn't champagne. While it is traditionally champagne to christen a ship with, this is New Jersey after all, so they christened it with New Jersey wine instead. That was done by Carolyn Edison of the Edisons. So Charles Edison, which is her husband, was at one point the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and then becomes the governor of New Jersey. So he's the one who was advocating for New Jersey to have a ship named after it. So they christened the ship on December 7th. Of course, the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor. She's the largest ship ever launched by the United States Navy at that point. But also there were a lot of other ships launched that day. They really wanted to sort of reclaim, say, hey, we are back. We've got our ships. We've got our big giant battleships. Here we are. We're ready to fight in this war full force. She is commissioned May 23rd, 1943. So if you do the math, that makes her 81 years old. We just celebrated 81. She spends the first little bit of World War II doing a shakedown cruise off the coast of Maine. She's ostensibly there looking for German battleships. She's looking for turbots. She does not find turbots, of course. She's really there just to make sure that the crew knows how everything on board works. And then she spends really the war in the Pacific. While she is in the Pacific, she will have a series of admirals on board. Particularly notably, we've got Admiral Halsey. He is also from the state of New Jersey, so of course he would want the Battleship New Jersey as his flagship. As a reminder, while a ship generally always has a captain, the captain is in charge of a ship and admiral's in charge of a group of ships. So Admiral Halsey is one of 4 men to ever achieve the status of 5 stars in the United States Navy. That's as high as you could possibly go, which is why he's somebody that we like to highlight. But honestly, we have our fair share of admirals over the years, even just during World War II. Generally, what happens on board our ship during the war is he will trade off with Admiral Spruance, and they did a slightly tricky move. So there is one group of ships, and they trade off the admiral. So instead of changing the horses, they change the driver, if that makes sense. So that way, it seems like there are twice as many ships. So when Admiral Halsey goes ashore, the name of the fleet of ships changes, and suddenly the Japanese thinks there's a whole new fleet of ships out there, even though it's the Same guy as it was before. So during the war, we end up at most of the major battles on the back end of World War II in the Pacific. So notably Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and then of course Leyte Gulf. Our big notable moment right at the beginning, though, as soon as we arrive, so very, very early in 1944, in February, we arrive at Truk Lagoon. Truk Lagoon, well, not the most famous of the Pacific battles, is a big moment for us. It also happens to be the longest shot fired from a moving vessel to another moving target. So that is us. Our big 16-inch guns, which we'll see a little bit later, are capable of firing 23 miles. And for that particular shot on a cruiser named Mikaze, it made it 20 miles. Now, technically, New Jersey did not actually hit the cruiser. It hit next to them, but it exploded, did damage to their ship, killed a couple of their sailors, so it is still counted as this for that longest shot. But like I said, Leyte Gulf is sort of our big famous moment during World War II. So again, we've got Admiral Halsey on board at that point. We are the flagship of the fleet, and there's a lot of things happening at Leyte Gulf. It's really more of a campaign than a direct battle. It just happens over the course of about a week or so. We are on the offensive side. There's another fleet of ships that is supposed to be doing more defensive work that happens to be doing some offensive work as they go. But of course, our big moment is Halsey takes New Jersey, the rest of what he has created as Task Force 34 to chase down the Japanese aircraft carriers. The idea is that if they can sink the carriers, they can turn the tide of war. This war is really being fought in the air, so they want to sink these carriers. Halsey goes chasing after them, and he gets almost within shooting range to be able to shoot at them with his guns from the Battleship New Jersey before he is forced to turn around to help that defensive force who is come under attack. Fortunately, over the course of this entire campaign, it was an overall success for the United States Navy. And Halsey comes out of this looking pretty good, even though he didn't quite get to do what he came for. We are not there, contrary to popular belief. The Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay at the end of the war. They decided that somebody needed to be outside of the general area just in case there was some sort of sneak attack. So instead, the battleship was in the Philippines with Admiral Spruance on board instead. So they'll switch off, like I said, who's on board and who's not. After the war, we mostly participate in something called Operation Magic Carpet, which is there's a lot of people who are still somewhere in Japan, China, the Philippines that need to get a ride home. So every ship's going to be participating in that. So we just take a few extra people on board. And then the ship itself will get decommissioned. After the war, we're not fighting. There's no reason to put all of the energy in maintaining and crewing a battleship of our size. Our sister Missouri was still around just in case they needed anything, but they didn't quite need New Jersey. However, not so long later, we get the Korean War. So the ship is reactivated for the Korean War. The ship does 2 deployments, so in 1951 and 1953. Generally, the job of the battleship over the course of her entire career is going to be doing shore bombardment. The one and only time we ever had that ship-to-ship combat was at Truk Lagoon. Otherwise, what tends to happen is someone on land says that they need assistance at such and such location, and it is our job to send a 2,700-pound shell in their direction. When it lands, it will make a 50-foot wide by 30-foot deep crater, which is roughly the size of an Olympic swimming pool. And hopefully scare off anybody that has been harassing the American Marines or whoever else needs our help. That's generally how it works. Sometimes they will come to us sort of a pre-planned list. We have X, Y, and Z targets. There's a bunker, there's a train station, there's a warehouse, something like that. But generally it's going to be things on land. During World War II, the ship does shoot down 20 planes, but it's just the 20 planes that came at us. It's not quite as planned. During the Korean War, we also have our fair share of admirals on board. Notably, we have Admiral J.J. Clark. J.J. Clark is often known as Jocko. He hated the nickname Jocko. He picked that up at the Naval Academy. He was a jock. He played football. Not a great nickname. But he does happen to be the Navy's first Native American admiral. He's Cherokee. He graduates from the Naval Academy right on the cusp of the American entry into World War I, which is why his time there actually gets cut short. He starts out on a cruiser called North Carolina, not to be confused with the battleship that's in the state of North Carolina. And that's where he falls in love with aviation. So he's primarily a carrier admiral, but during the Korean War, he chooses New Jersey as his flagship. Notably, in 1953, well, it's not the end of the war. The armistice, they signed the paperwork that says that we're not shooting at each other anymore. But in 1953, he's going to fly off of the Battleship New Jersey in our helicopter. It's called the Jersey Bounce. She's a Dragonfly helicopter, really small. He will fly off of the deck of our ship ashore to sign that paperwork. So he's one of our more famous sailors. That's what he looks like during World War II. During World War II, he's kind of notable for having been the XO, so second in charge on board USS Yorktown. He got off of Yorktown just before the Battle of Coral Sea, and then ends up as the pre-commissioning captain of a carrier named Suwannee. But when Yorktown CV-5 is sunk, they actually make him the captain of Yorktown CV-10. So he has a fairly notable career throughout from World War I, World War II, and Korea. Now we are decommissioned in the late 1950s. We did a lot of training cruises. They picked up a lot of midshipmen. They went to Europe a couple of times. But the ship sat around and waited and waited and waited for almost the entire 1960s until 1968 when she's reactivated for the Vietnam War. Now, notably for this reactivation, she's the only battleship in the entire world reactivated at this point. No other country and no other American battleships are there. She's the only one in Vietnam. And she actually wasn't the first choice. So here in Philadelphia, actually, they had 3 out of the 4 Iowa-class battleships all nested together. So the original choice was Wisconsin. When they got on board, though, they had discovered that she had had some sort of fire on board since she was last in service in the 1950s. It's still not entirely clear what happened. It seems to have been electrical and started in the fire control tower and just sort of burned through the ship. We've seen photos of it making it all the way down to the O2 level. So a couple of levels of the ship had some fires. They decided that it wasn't worth the effort to repair all of that. So next in line, they grabbed New Jersey. So New Jersey had a pretty basic reactivation to go to Vietnam. They took off the anti-aircraft guns that had been on the ship for the previous 2 wars. We have jets now. They just can't keep up. They were designed for World War II planes. So they removed that. They add some additional radio equipment. Sort of notably, there is that large antenna on the bow there. The crew likes to call it the Christmas tree antenna because it kind of looks like it and is occasionally lit up with Christmas lights to look like that. Formerly, it's part of the discone cage antenna. It is one of the earliest additions to the ship for something called NTDS, Naval Tactical Data System. It's basically like early internet for ships. They can communicate with one another basic battle information. I see a thing coming towards us so that everybody in the fleet knows. We were part of the early systems, so we had the ability to send information, but we couldn't even receive information. That's how early this is. But Vietnam is going to be our really most active year of the ship. We're only in service for about a year and a half. We're only in Vietnam for a little bit less than a year, but they fire more rounds in Vietnam than they do in World War II and Korea combined off of the ship. They are busy. And now their primary role, like I said, is going to be shore bombardment. So the sort of famous story associated with that is there were some Marines up on a mountain. They get on the radio, they call up the battleship, they say, I am located here. The enemy is located here, and here, and here, and here, and here. They charted it out in our plotting room, and they realized that these Marines were completely surrounded. So, okay, give us about 2 minutes. It takes roughly 30 seconds to load the guns and about a minute and a half for it to travel the roughly 20 miles it needed to go to get there. So about 2 minutes later, they call them back and they say, well, how does the mountain look? Marines respond, what mountain? The mountain's gone. It's what the ship does. She changes the geography. She is there to protect American lives wherever she's sent. So when she first arrives off the coast of Vietnam, being the only battleship in the world, she's a little popular. So she's got quite a few reporters on board. So she sails past Han Mott Island. Now, Hanmat Island is, well, they have told the American ships to give them a really wide berth. They have been firing on American ships since the beginning of the war. They can't really do much damage, but it's just easier just to give them some space and stay out of their way. No one tells Captain Snyder, in charge of Battleship New Jersey, where he can and cannot sail his battleship. So he, of course, decides to sail it right past the island. And of course, they fire upon us. Now, we have a lot of armor, and they have some pretty small guns. So they can't actually hit us, but they did fire on us, which doesn't sit well with Captain Snyder. So he decides that he is going to turn his guns upon the islands. Not the small ones, the big ones, the big 16-inch guns. So they fire a couple of salvos on the island, and the person who was spotting for us, making sure that we hit our targets, because we tend to be firing 20 miles away, even 10 miles away, it's very hard to see what you've actually hit. So there's a pilot in the air flying a plane from a local aircraft carrier, and he realizes that part of the island, one of the cliffs, has sloughed off into the sea. So he describes it as us having sunk an island. Now, when he reports this on the radio, several of the reporters on board, including the AP reporter, heard this and made that their headline, which means that headlines across the world the following day was Battleship New Jersey sinks an island. So that's sort of our big claim to fame right at the beginning of the war. But that's what we do for about a year. Sometimes it's things like there was a hospital that was helping American servicemen, and they kept getting attacked. So what does the battleship do? They continue to fire in the general area of the hospital, and then they get a call saying, we have an ambulance coming in. They hold fire. They let the ambulance come in, and then they go back to firing in the general area to prevent other people from coming up who shouldn't be near the hospital. They did this for almost a month, just constant firing. So that's part of why they fire so many more rounds in Vietnam than in her other eras. Vietnam also happens to be, this is footage that the crew took on board, so you can see one of the helicopters landing. They are landing at what the crew called, and they wrote on the deck this, New Jersey International. They got a whole lot of traffic at our helipad back there during the war. And part of that was because they were participating in something called Operation Hilton. Well, participating might not be the right word. They created this operation. So essentially what happens is Captain Snyder, he is the crew's beloved captain through the war. He decides that the Marines on shore could use some additional help beyond fire support. So he brings several of them by helicopter to the ship constantly. Some come on, they come off, new ones come on throughout the whole time that they're there, just for R&R. On board the battleship, it's a pretty nice experience in comparison to where they're coming from. They've got air conditioning and a place to get your boots repaired, hot meals all day long, a bed that hasn't rotted in the Vietnamese climate, and some place to just sleep where you're not being shut at. The crew absolutely loved having these guys on board. As a reminder, while our crew wasn't necessarily drafted, a lot of them didn't entirely volunteer to be there. A lot of these guys joined the Navy because they knew they were going to be drafted and chose the Navy so they wouldn't get stuck in the Army or the Marines. So they knew that they could have been that guy. They also knew that those Marines that were coming to them could have been their friends, their neighbors, their brothers. So they took really good care of them when they came on board. They were always the first to offer up and say, hey, do you need my bed? Though fortunately they had plenty on board, so it wasn't too big of an issue there. But the sort of famous story for us is there was a sailor working on the Challenger serving food, and he's handing out pie, and one of the Marines comes by and says, can I get an extra slice of pie? And the guy serving it says, I'll give you the whole pie. He knows that this Marine might not make it home, and he might not ever eat a slice of pie again. So they're particularly generous with him. Now, the sailor serving the pie, his chief came up to him and said, you can't do that, man. We don't have enough pie to do that. You can't keep giving away pies. And the guy gives his chief some sass, and he ends up having to clean the entire galley with a toothbrush. This man, to this day, says it was absolutely worth it. That is their job, is to take care of these guys in every way they can. Those Marines come back and visit us as a museum all the time. They show up, they kiss the deck, they ask about Captain Snyder. They want to thank the people who were on the ship. And we're pretty lucky. Our Vietnam sailors are our most active crew for those who come back to visit us. We have about 50,000 people who served on the ship over the course of her career, with about probably 2,500 that served during Vietnam. And they, more so than anybody, love to come back to visit us. Next week happens to be our crew reunion week. So we have invited them all to come back to visit us. And they will be disproportionately from our Vietnam era. So one of the difficult things with our Vietnam era is that the ship in summer of 1969 loses Captain Snyder. He gets promoted. They make him an admiral, but he leaves the ship. He's replaced by Captain Robert Peniston. Now, Captain Robert Peniston's first ship out of the Naval Academy was New Jersey. So he was very excited to come back to his old ship as captain. The problem is, about 4 hours after he arrives, he's told it's his job to decommission it. He has to kill the ship. So instead of this being the highlight of his career, it's the worst part of his career. Now, he doesn't want the ship decommissioned, not just because it's bad for his career, but because he knows what the ship does is important. The crew thinks the same thing. So they start this letter writing campaign. They write letters to Congress, the Navy, to the president. They are begging everyone, do not decommission the ship. It is important. But the politicians get involved. They decide that the war isn't going to end. No one's coming to peace talks if the battleship is there. So she gets decommissioned December 17th, 1969. When they do this, Captain Peniston reads some of these letters. Letters from the mothers of Marines. You know, my son is only alive because Battleship New Jersey is there. He cries through the entire speech. The audience cries through the entire speech. It's a great speech. But one of the things that he says at the very end, rest well, yet sleep lightly. For the call to freedom will, if again sounded, to provide firepower for freedom. They are convinced the ship's going to come back. Once the politicians get through what they need, they will reactivate the ship, send her back to Vietnam, and do what she does best. She doesn't. She ends up missing the entire 1970s. She's just sitting in mothballs, waiting in Bremerton. But the crew strongly believes in her. And so does Ronald Reagan, because she comes back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, she gets some serious upgrades. We now have missiles. So she is a much more modern ship at this point. She is going to have a much wider variety of things that she is capable of doing. But like I said, President Reagan absolutely loves the battleships. He picks us to be activated first just because we were the last to be deactivated. So we're the most modern and in the best condition. But I'll let him speak for himself just a little bit here. Or not. So this is our commissioning. So when they put the ship back into service, this is a special moment for us because it's the only time that a battleship has ever been recommissioned by a sitting president. You can see the windows up there with all the sailors in them. Now, this is actually a particular special moment for us today because the next New Jersey is about to go through this process. SSN 796, she is a submarine. She is being commissioned this Saturday. We'll talk a little bit about her later. So our time in the 1980s, like I said, our big hallmark here is, of course, our missiles. We do end up with a couple of different types. What you've probably seen on the news before are Tomahawk missiles. We are still using those in the Navy, the Army, the Air Force today. Tomahawk missiles have a pretty long range on them. They come in a couple of varieties, but notably, they can be nuclear. The Navy, of course, will neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons aboard their ships. So I can't tell you for certain that we carried nuclear missiles, but here's the evidence. We know that the console that they are launched from has the place where you insert the key and it says nuclear permission to fire on it. We know we have the keys. We found them on board in a desk. That's a really weird day for us. We do know that some of the Tomahawks, the launchers they were in, those launchers were always guarded by armed Marines. Only some of the boxes. Now, we've asked the Marines what was in the boxes, and the Marines told us that they weren't told what was in them, but they always assumed they were nuclear weapons. So the crew on board believes we carry them, and we certainly have the capability to carry them. The public regularly protested us. Greenpeace loved to paint the side of the ship red in anger with us because they didn't want us bringing nuclear weapons into their ports. So the public believe we carry them. So while we can't say for certain, we most likely did. Now, for us, our Tomahawk missiles are going to be land attack missiles. That means that from New Jersey, we can hit Texas from here. It's So they've got a nice long range on them. But we did also carry harpoon missiles. Those are going to be anti-ship. Those are not so rarely used. As far as I can tell, the American Navy has never fired a harpoon missile in anger. They did fire some in tests over the summer as part of the RIMPAC exercises. We fired one in a test at a submarine, USS Grayback. In both cases, they're SyncXs. They are deliberately trying to sink a ship with some new technology to confirm that it works. It does. As far as we can tell, and things are still coming in, there seemed to be some use of harpoon missiles in the Black Sea over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years, that the conflict's been happening there. And it seems like they've sunk a ship or two with them. So they're still getting tested out, and as historians, we're not totally sure what's happening yet, but it seems to be the case. Now, of course, while our missiles are sort of our big attraction in the 1980s, if you just wanted missiles, you wouldn't reactivate a battleship. Of course, the big excitement is our 16-inch guns. And they do pack a punch. That particular clip there is the last shots fired from the ship during the Vietnam War. So you can see, oh, it's New Jersey International written on our flight deck back there. The video on the left that's now starting to play shows you a little bit about how these guns work. So the turrets themselves do rotate. Takes 88 seconds to fully rotate from the extreme port to the extreme starboard. It's a little bit more than 180 degrees. And there is an internal conveyor belt to help move the projectiles around. You can see that the turrets themselves are 5, maybe 6 levels high. They're a little weird, and one of them is actually a little bit taller than the other. But it ends up being about 80 people inside to fire the guns, which, like I said before, is about a 30-second timing to be able to get through the whole thing. So the gentlemen here are coming into our turret. This looks like either 1 or 3. And the mechanism that they are working there is going to be bringing the powder in from the magazine. So we store our gunpowder outside of the gun turrets for safety, and then it comes into them in these big, giant marshmallow-looking powder bags. Each one of those bags weighs 110 pounds. You can see those guys are working really hard. It takes 6 bags, 660 pounds of gunpowder to fire 1 round. Now, turrets like ours, we have typically 2 different types of projectiles. We have a 1,900 pound and a 2,700 pound. So we have an armor piercing round, that's the heavier one. The armor piercing round is designed for that battleship on battleship conflict that we don't get, or the way that we end up using it is against big concrete bunkers on land. If we are not going against something armored, so we're just defoliating the jungle, we will send out the smaller 1,900 pounds high capacity round. If you're used to artillery, you might be used to high explosive. This is similar to that, but the way the fuse works is slightly different, so it's called high capacity round instead. But essentially, it makes a giant hole. It's very good at that. Like I said, we can fire these rounds every 30 seconds, and that's every 30 seconds per barrel. We have 9 barrels, and it can take up to like 2 minutes to get there. And for a sense of scale, one of the ways that they described it in the 1980s is that the shell rate weighs roughly as much as a Volkswagen Bug. So CBS News, when we got to Lebanon in the 80s, described it as a new and awesome presence has arrived, capable of throwing a Volkswagen Bug 23 miles. We can put 27 of them in the air at a time. So while it is slow, it takes a couple of minutes to get there, it's going to make a serious difference when it gets there, which is why we tend not to do the rapid fire with our guns that you would see with a smaller weapon. It's not the constant deluge. Gets loaded into the gun first. The barrel does need to be lowered back down to level to be able to load it, just because it is so heavy. But that gets loaded in, and then our powder will come out. There's our powder. There's our powder. And then be loaded in 3 bags at a time, rammed in, and then 3 more bags before they get ready to close the breech and fire the gun. So, like I said, the 1980s are some of our more interesting years because it's less of a specific conflict and war. We tend to end up all over the place. Notably, we end up in Lebanon when the Marine barracks is bombed. We lose a sailor there, Chief Gorchinsky. In our ship's entire 50-year career, in the 3-4-ish wars that the ship gets involved in, we only lose 1 sailor in combat actually on the ship. So that's 1951 Seaman Robert Osterwind, We get hit by a shore battery, probably 6-inch round. The front face of turret 1. There's no damage to the ship. Kills Seaman Osterwin, who just happens to be standing in the exact wrong spot, and then a couple of people around him are injured. That's it. So losing Gorczynski, even though he was on land in the 1980s, was a big deal for the ship, and our crew participated in the cleanup. If you're unfamiliar with the Marine barracks bombing, somebody drove a truck bomb into the barracks. So it created a lot of debris. So our crew helped with the cleanup on that. But we participated in a lot of other things as well. So this particular clip is from getting ready for a Tiger cruise. So the family gets to bring, or the crew gets to bring their families on board. And they get to see, oh, what's Dad's ship look like? And they fire the guns for the kids, and they give everybody a tour, and everyone eats on the mess decks and things like that. So this is them sort of getting ready for it. But it is a nice reminder that our ship is still pretty modern. She gets decommissioned in 1991. We have a television studio on board. We have the internet eventually. We have fairly modern amenities. I would say if there's a big difference between New Jersey at decommissioning and what an active ship today is, the big difference is just that an active ship today has women on it, as opposed to in 1991, we didn't put women on combat ships. Otherwise, it's basically the same. That gender difference means that there is a slight difference in our berthing. So we have fewer walls. People just kind of walk around back in our day, as opposed to having more sort of segregated berthing spaces now. But otherwise, all basically the same. So the ship was decommissioned in 1991. They decided that they just didn't want to pay for the 2.5 million gallons of basically diesel fuel that they burn through every week. And all the crews. She gets decommissioned until the next war. And then by 1999, they decided that they would just completely strike her from the Naval Registry, so she cannot be reactivated, at least not easily. And that's when they passed her over to us as a museum since our opening day in 2001. We're actually just coming up on our anniversary. We opened up right after 9/11, actually. So if you haven't come out to see the ship, definitely do. Some of the cool spaces you can see on board. This is our combat engagement center. When I mentioned before that we have a console that can insert the nuclear launch keys into, the console's right in here. You can actually see it on the right hand of the screen there. There's those 2 chairs. Both of those consoles is where you enter the keys. And we actually have the keys on display. As far as I can tell, it's the only place in the world that you can see the nuclear launch keys, which is a pretty special thing. Elsewhere on board, as you tour around, you can see some of the other more modern weaponry. So on the right-hand side here, we've got our Sea-Whiz phalanx. It's basically a machine gun connection to a computer. If it senses something big enough, moving fast enough towards us, it will shoot it down without asking any questions. They still use this today. It's something that they have to be very careful with, because otherwise it will accidentally shoot down your own helicopter. So it's not something that's always turned on. It's a very good defensive weapon. On the left-hand side here, we have our chaff. Essentially, it's firing shredded aluminum foil. So an incoming missile's looking for a large hot metal object. We have created one. So that missile will lock onto that instead of hitting us. As I mentioned before, we've got our Tomahawk missiles. So this is what they look like up close. You'll notice that they are in these boxes that kind of look like shipping containers. They rise up like that, and then they launch right across the ship. Our problem is we can't reload these at sea. We have 32. After we have fired 32, we are out of missiles. So that makes them a little bit more difficult to work with than, say, our 16-inch guns, which we can reload out at sea. We don't have to come back into port to get new ones. For an idea of what crew life is like, this is what our berthing compartments are. So where the crew lives, that's 3 beds high. We sleep right on top of each other. It's very close. We call these coffin racks because they're closed in on almost every side. And they've got the curtain to close that last side as well. It is cozy. We do offer a program letting people sleep on the ship. It's mostly Boy Scouts. We love when their adults come with them though. And that's the same beds that they sleep on as well. This is cruise mess here where our crew eats their meals. You'll notice it's, we like to call them McDonald's style tables here. They serve 4 meals a day on board this ship: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and midnight rations. Food's generally regarded as being pretty good. It's made by the crew themselves. They've got to eat it, so they might as well make something good. And it varies a lot. By the 1980s, they're serving essentially 2 meals at a time. They will do whatever the meal of the day is. It could be tacos or spaghetti or Chinese food or meatloaf, whatever it is. And then they will serve every night burgers and fries and hot dogs. Because the crew's kind of gotten used to fast food, so it's always an option. We do, of course, have a salad bar and the ever-present ice cream machine. And of course, the Navy floats on coffee, so the coffee is always flowing here. In comparison, this is our officers' mess. This is the wardroom. So the people in charge of the ship where they eat their meals. They tend to eat the same thing every day that the rest of the crew is eating. But if they're doing burger night, the officers get to decide that they like theirs done medium rare versus the guys down on the chow line, the enlisted guys, they just get a burger handed to them. So it just kind of depends on the final quality level. This is our captain's cabin. We've got 19 commanding officers of the ship, but notably in here, you will see the silver on the right-hand side of the screen. It was made for the first Battleship New Jersey, that's BB-16. She was sunk in 1923 off the coast of one of the Carolinas in a test, in a sink-X, just like us sinking USS Greyback. In that test, they wanted to find out whether or not airplanes can sink battleships. They can. So without the old New Jersey, it got passed along to us. And then some of that silver will be passed along this week to the new New Jersey, to the submarine. They're going to get a couple of the sort of like goblet things. So that'll be very exciting for them. They are much smaller than us, so they don't have room for the full set. So we're just giving them a couple of pieces. This is our conning tower. So this is where we steer the ship from. Though we do have 4 steering positions, this is also one of the only places that you can really see the armor. It's what makes up the ship after all. So it's hard to sort of see what it really looks like. But here you can see that door. It's 17 inches thick. The door weighs more than my car. So it's protecting the people inside who are actually steering the ship. We are regarded as the world's fastest battleship. So this is a clip inside one of our fire rooms, one of our engineering spaces. She officially tops out at 32 knots. That's what she's rated for. But one particular day in 1968, she made it up to 35 knots, which makes her the world's fastest battleship if you look it up in the Guinness Book of World Records. She originally is powered by bunker fuel, which is not really a liquid. It has to be heated to be run through the pipes and switches over to a distillate, basically diesel in the 1980s. Like I said before, she carries 2.5 million gallons of it, and it's just going to be burned to boil the water to make the steam. Steam turns the turbines, that's what moves the ship. We've got 8 boilers powering 4 engines, turning 4 screws, 4 propellers. So it's a pretty simple system. It's all purely mechanical. They will take some of the bled off steam into our turbo generators. We do also have helicopters. While the ship throughout most of her career did not have helicopters assigned, while we were in Lebanon, we did. It looked very similar to this one, though isn't exactly this one. This is a Sea Sprite. That's the type of helicopter that we had. The crew called our Sea Sprite Sea Snake. But as I said before, there is a new USS New Jersey. She is getting commissioned this Saturday, so we are going to have to give up our name just a little bit. She's getting commissioned in Earl. They will be live streaming the ceremony. I've been checking it out. I know that the submarine has already arrived in the state of New Jersey. So exactly what she's going to be doing, I couldn't tell you. But she does what all submarines do, which is sail around and make sure that her presence is not known, and everyone knows they're out there somewhere. So she's got a couple interesting features, particularly that she doesn't have a traditional periscope. She's got a photonics mast. Basically means they put a camera on a stick. So instead of having something with like a lens that they can physically see out of, it's a camera doing that, sending them back to them instead. Which means that their entire ability to see outside of their submarine, aside from using sonar and those sorts of sensors, is controlled by an Xbox. They said, hey, all the kids who are sailing on the ship, they know how to use an Xbox, so that's how we're going to control it. So this is from her launch, the first time that she was put in the water. She's built down in Virginia. Back to us a little bit, what we've been up to lately. So you might have heard that the ship has been in dry dock. They took her out of the water. So this is what she looked like when she first came out of the water. You can see that we are in pretty good condition. There's no water pouring out of the bottom. That's how you know that we're okay. She does have some mud on her, some rain growth at this point, but they pressure washed that off, and she looked pretty gorgeous. You can see she's got a couple of barnacles, but again, no water coming out of her. Throughout the course of this project, we were able to thoroughly inspect the entire underwater hull. She got a complete new fresh coat of paint. We did a little bit of repair work on her bow where it wasn't leaking, but the steel was pretty thin, so additional plates were added there. And overall, she got a once-over to make sure that there wasn't anything wrong with her. And that's what she looks like in the end. So this was right before being refloated. You can see the water's already starting to come in. This was in mid-June of this year. And then she was brought back here to Camden. We reopened right before the 4th of July. So as I said before, do come out and visit us if you haven't seen us before. We have roughly 2 miles to tour out. There's plenty to see. We got a kids room, bring the grandkids, check it out. Yeah, we're open every day. But I would love to answer questions if you have questions about the world's greatest battleship, as the crew like to call her.
Are you still there? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I have a question. How long does it take to make a U-turn with a boat like that? You know, I have a little sailboat and I can make a U-turn in about 20 feet. But a boat like that, how long does it take? How many miles? I'm surprised that there is no, oh no, I forgot the name. There's some boats have a propeller in the front. Oh gosh, I forgot the name of that system. And it allows the boats to turn on a dime. I'm surprised that this one doesn't have that. Maybe because it was built so long ago.
So surprisingly, despite that she's 900 feet long, despite the size of the ship, she's about 900 feet long. She has an excellent tactical diameter. So that is the technical term for the U-turn. In reality, we can make a full circle in less than 900 feet, less than the total length of the ship. So she's actually very maneuverable, more so even than some of the other ships that travel with us. So while, for those of you boaters out there, you probably know this, we follow the rule of tonnage. Whoever is biggest has right of way. That's usually us. We're bigger than World War II aircraft carriers even. By the later years, the super carriers are going to be bigger than us, so we yield to them. But in general, everyone yields to us. But we've got a very good diameter. We turn very quickly. So better than you'd think.
I remember it's called a bow thruster.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
900 feet, that's really amazing. Are the props directional? Can you move the props right and left,
ours
or
are
is it
fixed.
just a tiller?
They don't move at all. They're fixed. So we do have 2 rudders. That is going to help. And we have something just here. So you can see between our 2 propellers here that they're the 2 inboard propellers, that there is this sort of alleyway thing. We call it the Holland Tunnel because it's got more traffic than anywhere else in New Jersey. So the water that's coming down the Holland Tunnel is forced directly onto those 2 propellers there, and then the 2 rudders are directly after that, and that is going to help with our tactical diameter. So our ability to turn is really helped by that sort of water pressure there. But we can't move the propellers; they're not variable like you'll see on some ships.
Is the commissioning of the new New Jersey submarine, is that open to the public?
So the commissioning of the new submarine is technically open to the public, but I know that tickets sold out like 6 months ago. So if you don't already have a ticket, unfortunately, it is not open to you. But again, they will be live streaming it online. Not 100% sure where, unfortunately. Probably if you Google SSN 796, it'll show up, I'm sure. So.
Second question, how many shells did the New Jersey hold, and how do they rearm it? How do they bring more shells to it?
So all told, we can hold about 1,000 shells for the big guns. I'll just focus on the big guns here. So rearming is actually pretty simple for us. We can do something called underway replenishment. This is something that doesn't really exist prior to World War II, but absolutely changes the way that we fight the war. So underway replenishment is pretty simple. Another ship sails up alongside us, and then we can move stuff from one ship to the next in a couple of different ways, primarily by high line. So it's a zip line, basically. You put stuff on a wire and it moves from ship to ship that way. We can move stuff by helicopter as well. It depends on exactly what the area is and what's going on. We'll do ammunition, food, fuel, people, all the same way. So once it actually gets on board, they tend to stack it up on deck for a little while they get organized. And then the actual trunks for getting it into the turrets are underneath the back side of the turrets. So you actually have to rotate the turrets so they're no longer facing forward or aft. They have to be facing off to the side. And then there's just a straight trunk they can drop them down. And then they'll be lowered down on usually chain fall to the lower levels. And then they take, it's essentially a train ride. We have these I-beams that run through that part of the ship. So they'll get hooked onto another chain fall there and then put in their allotted location. It's time consuming. It's slow. It's a little dangerous. They tend to drop them on occasion. So you definitely don't want to be underneath them while they're moving. There are a few dents in our deck from them being dropped. Like I said, they weigh as much as a car. So they do make a serious dent when they drop. Fortunately, they're pretty hardy. They are designed to be shot out of the guns. So they don't explode when they drop. They did learn that. But it is enough to give everybody a good scare.
Yes. About 30 years ago, when my boys were in Boy Scouts, we visited USS Massachusetts, which is another large battleship. That ship was not nearly as good shape as USS New Jersey is. My question is, how many battleships are still there that you can actually come and visit? And also, do you have any relationship with the entities that maintain these battleships in other states?
So in the United States alone, there are 8 museum battleships. There's no active battleships anywhere in the world, but there are 8 museum battleships in the United States. There happens to be a 9th in Japan. That's Mikasa, but otherwise there aren't any other battleships out there as museums. Of the 8 battleships in the United States, we all talk to each other all the time about everything. I've talked to 3 of them so far today. We're all fall under something called the Historic Naval Ships Association. Actually, our annual conference kicks off on Monday. So we'll all get together in San Diego to talk about rust. It's 5 days of corrosion, and corrosion. So we do try and give each other all the help that we can to make sure that we can all do the best that we can. We are very fortunate being decommissioned as recently as she was in 1991. She's only had 30 years since the Navy was maintaining her, which is why we're in better shape than most of the other older battleships like Massachusetts. She's had like 70 years to degrade. So most of these museum ships, they only have a handful of staff doing the best they can to keep these things maintained. So yeah, we do try and share that knowledge best that we can. When we were in dry dock, we saw must have been 24 different museums who came by to inspect on what we were doing as they get ready to go through the similar process. So Battleship Texas was in dry dock immediately before us. They just got out right before we got in. We went and visited them 3 times to see their project. USS Kidd, not a battleship, but another museum ship. She's a destroyer, is in dry dock right now. So we've been talking to them constantly, helping them get ready. So we talk all the time.
Quite a fascinating story. Thank you. I'm curious now about these 16-inch guns, the big guns. There's so much talk about them. I have several questions, and you can answer any of these or all of them or none of them. Were comparable 16-inch guns deployed on other ships, other battleships? Are there any larger guns than 16-inch? What smaller guns did the battleship, the New Jersey, have? And also, nowadays we're hearing about artillery that has smart projectiles, like HIMARS. We read about HIMARS being used in Ukraine. So the projectiles themselves have electronics in them and can guide themselves so they can have pinpoint accuracy. You know, if you're going to fire a round that's 30 miles away, you got to have pretty good aim and know something about the wind patterns in between, I guess. But if you have self-guidance, then you're going to hit the target every time. So I was wondering if these 16-inch shells ever, at the end of their useful lifetime, got redesigned to have smart navigation in the shell itself.
Okay, so that's a bunch of questions. I'm going to try and answer all of them. So first and foremost, we have 3 sister ships. They have identical 16-inch guns to us. And then there are 2 classes of ships before us that have Very, very similar 16-inch guns like USS Massachusetts. They're not completely the same, but they're basically the same. They do not put any larger guns on an American ship ever. That is the largest size. The Japanese do produce 18-inch guns. They have some issues with fire control and their accuracy, so they're not as great. They don't develop smart rounds or anything for our guns. That would be cool. They never do that. What we're using is a Mark 8 fire control computer that was built in 1939. It's an electromechanical analog computer that runs off of gears. You can power it by hand cranking it. It works great. It does account for all of those variables. So it specifically is focusing on we're a moving target. We're trying to hit a moving target. So it is accounting for this much time has elapsed, so they have moved this far and they are no longer at the coordinate that we said that we were. But it does account for wind speed, temperature outside, temperature in the magazine, even variables with the powder itself, because it gets a little wonky. It's not always as consistent as we had hoped it would be. So that computer is going to be doing that work. It was so good at what it did and accurate that they continued to use it throughout the ship's entire career. They considered replacing it with a more modern computer in the 1980s and realized the more modern computer wasn't going to be more accurate, and then they'd have to rewire the whole turret. And then you're more likely to have electrical problems, which cause the whole system to break down. So we got to keep the system. And our computer still works. Come by, you can see it run. It is a true marvel of engineering, but it is simple. But I like to think of 16-inch guns like horseshoes and hand grenades. Close is fine. It makes a 50-foot crater. We're often sending enough of them out there. We're destroying whole areas that it doesn't quite need to be that pinpoint accuracy that we see on the news now, where they want to send missiles through somebody's window 1,000 miles away. We're not doing that. We have missiles. They do have that high accuracy, and that's great. But for the purposes of the guns, they're not looking for that. They're just looking for giant craters, really. I think that answered all of them.
Walter Meisner?
Okay. That was a nice historical presentation of the U.S. New Jersey. Back in the 90s, I did have an occasion to tour the ship. I was part of a boating organization, and one of the members actually served on the ship and became a docent, and gave us a special tour. And that some of the notable things that I remember is I believe the ship has teak decks, and he said the reason they have teak decks is to keep the heat from going down below. But even in spite of that, it got like 105 underneath the deck. And then the other interesting things were the round safe house which is on the midship, which he showed a picture of. Where the captain and navigator and the officers can control the entire ship under heavy fire, without being disrupted. Normally it would be, controlled from another area. And the other interesting thing was the replacement of the normal anti-aircraft guns, which are usually, operated by the sailors, to go over to the phalanx, radar guided phalanx systems, which does everything automatically. So to me, that was, the most impressive things. And the ship looks a whole lot better than I saw it in 1990. And, the one question I have is, what's the exact process for decommissioning a ship?
So decommissioning a ship looks a little different for every ship, depending on its final fate. When they decommissioned us, they were pretty confident that the ship was going to be reactivated, so they did fairly minimal work. One of the big things they do, and you can see, not quite any of these pictures, but they covered up all the through-hole openings in the bottom of the ship. We bring in a lot of water for our boilers and drinking water and things like that. So those all got sealed shut, so while there wasn't a crew on board, things weren't going to leak. So that's the big work that they did. They did some amount of work to our engines at decommissioning. They have not told us specifically what they did. We're not supposed to go investigate and find out. We know that we're not allowed to run the engines. That's about all we know. They didn't really do much work to the gun turrets at decommissioning. They wrapped some things in oil and tarps just to keep them preserved and kind of just be ripped off when they were ready to be reactivated. They did some electrical demilitarization, so they went through with wire cutters and just seemingly arbitrarily cut things as they saw fit. Like all the phone lines were cut for some reason, but almost everything else wasn't. We're not really sure why they made those decisions. Otherwise, everything was pretty much left as is, so much so that the crew was completely convinced that she would be reactivated and left notes on their desks that said things like, so the turbo generator number 7 tends to stick on this lever, so make sure you give it an extra shove. And we stored extra parts for this other thing in this room over here. And for whatever reason, the toilets in the officer's head keep spouting back up. We're not sure why that happens. Sorry, good luck. Like they left all this behind for us because they knew someone else was coming. So they didn't do too much for decommissioning. Some ships will have pretty much everything stripped out of them, maybe put on other ships, maybe just put into a warehouse for storage. Some ships, if they're slated to be scrapped, they'll have everything all separated out. Or if they're being sold, in general, the first thing that happens is they take off all of the classified material. So, hey, if we've got nuclear rounds or any sort of paperwork on board, they'll take all that off. The special radio equipment, things like that. The Navy then comes through after they remove the classified material, and the Naval's History and Heritage Command takes the historically significant parts. So the bells, the name off the bag. If there's paintings, if there's anything that seems historically significant to them, they just take stuff. They've got a warehouse full of it, and then they put it in their museums or give it to other museums to display. We came back as a museum. They generally gave us everything back. Though our name board is still has Battleship Wisconsin has it for reasons I don't understand. But we mostly got everything of ours back. So it's a pretty simple process. For us, it took place over the course of about 3 months.
Thank you. Our last question, Mike.
Thank you very much for a most interesting talk. In fact, I was in Vietnam when the New Jersey was on station, and wasn't personally involved with what happened there, but I knew all about it, and very glad to hear that the ship was preserved in this manner. I just thought I'd mention many of you knew Hugo Falls, who was a member of this club for many years, and my former colleague in law practice in Summit. And Hugo was a member of the New Jersey Battleship Commission, which had the mission of determining where in New Jersey the ship would eventually be berthed. And it turned out it was between Bayonne and Camden. And Hugo, of course, was pushing for Bayonne, but he lost, so the ship is now in Camden. And I still have New Jersey license plates on my car, and Hugo did too, so it's a great story about a great ship.
Thank you for your service, sir.
Okay, as our normal policy is, we give every presenter a certificate, and the certificate
Thank you, guys.
highlights part of Summit's background and history as a orchid producing facility or area. That's no longer the case, but it's still. Anyway, we'd like to give in addition to the certificate, an old guard salute. So I'd ask everybody to stand.